I thought I was watching my daughter's fairy tale unfold. I thought the tears on my cheeks were happy ones, the kind a mother earns after years of worry and sleepless nights and whispered prayers in dark kitchens at 3 in the morning. I thought Daniel was exactly what Sophie had always deserved: steady, handsome, a man who looked at her like she had personally arranged the stars. I was wrong about every single thing. By the time the reception music faded and the videographer pressed his phone into my hands with trembling fingers, I understood that I had spent the last 14 months being carefully, methodically deceived, not just by the man standing at my daughter's altar, but by his mother, Vivian, who had smiled at me across every dinner table and called me a blessing while quietly feeding her son a script designed to dismantle everything my own father had built and left behind for Sophie to inherit. The wedding had never been about love. It had been an acquisition. My name is Margaret. I am 53 years old, and until the day of my daughter's wedding, I considered myself a reasonably perceptive woman. I had raised Sophie alone after her father left when she was 7. Not dramatically, not with shouting or slam doors, but with the quiet, bloodless efficiency of a man who had simply decided that fatherhood was a chapter he preferred to close. I had worked. I had built. I had turned a modest catering business into something real. A reputation, a client list, a small but respected name in this city's event industry. I had done it while making Sophie's lunches and attending her school plays and sitting in the front row of every recital, even when I was so tired my vision blurred at the edges. Sophie was my life's work, more than any contract or catered gala had ever been. The house I lived in was not grand, but it was mine. A red brick colonial with a wraparound porch on Aldersham Lane, the kind of house that smelled like old wood in Sunday mornings, where the radiators knocked cheerfully in winter, and the hydrangeas along the front walk bloomed so reliably every June that the neighbors stopped to photograph them. My father had helped me buy it years ago, and after he passed, he left the bulk of his estate, a trust valued at nearly $400,000, to Sophie, with the provision that she would receive full access upon marriage or at age 30, whichever came first. Sophie was 27. She had 9 months left before the age threshold. And then, in what felt like divine timing, she had met Daniel Hargrove at a colleague's dinner party and fallen in love with the kind of speed that makes a mother's heart stutter between joy and unease. I had liked Daniel immediately, which I now understand was part of the problem. He was the sort of man who was good at being liked. He remembered small things. That I preferred sparkling water, that I found certain kinds of loud music physically exhausting, that I lit a candle on my father's birthday every year and sat quietly for an hour. He asked about my catering business with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He called me Margaret in a warm, unhurried way that felt respectful without being stiff. Sophie glowed around him. She laughed differently, lighter, looser. And I told myself that this was what I had been working toward all those years, my daughter, finally, at rest. Vivian, his mother, was another matter, though I told myself for a long time that I was being uncharitable. She was elegant in the particular way that costs money and effort and implies both effortlessly. Silver-haired, always in silk or cashmere, with a posture that suggested she had never once slumped in a chair. She hosted us for dinner in her townhouse on 3 separate occasions before the engagement, and each time I left feeling faintly unsettled in a way I could not cleanly name. The rooms were immaculate in that airless way that suggests a space is curated rather than lived in. She was warm to Sophie and courteous to me, but there was something behind her eyes when she looked at me. A calculating stillness, the way a chess player watches the board when it is not their turn. I mentioned this to my friend Patricia once, sitting on her porch with glasses of white wine, and she laughed and told me I was projecting. Maybe I was. I wanted to believe I was. The engagement was announced on a Saturday in November. Sophie called me before she called anyone else, and I cried before I had even hung up the phone, standing in my kitchen in my bathrobe with the coffee going cold on the counter. I was genuinely, uncomplicated happy. I told myself that happiness this simple was a gift. I told myself I deserved it. The first strange thing happened 2 weeks after the engagement, though I did not catalog it as strange until much later. I had stopped by Sophie's apartment with a casserole. She had been working late, and I worried she wasn't eating properly, which is the kind of worry that does not expire with your child's childhood. I let myself in with the spare key she'd given me, and I heard her in the bedroom, not quite arguing, but speaking in that low, controlled voice she used when she was trying not to lose her temper. I set the dish on the kitchen counter and was about to call out when I caught a fragment of what she was saying. "I just don't understand why she needs to know that, Daniel. That's my money. My grandfather left it to me." Then a pause, then quieter. I know you're not saying that. Can we not talk about this tonight?" I heard Daniel's voice then, low and soothing and indistinct. I set my keys down on the counter too hard by accident, and Sophie appeared in the hallway looking flushed, and she smiled too quickly and said I was a lifesaver, and we ate the casserole together at her kitchen table and talked about the venue options, and I told myself the conversation I had half heard was nothing. A couple navigating finances, normal, healthy even. But I thought about it on the drive home. I thought about the phrase my grandfather left it to me, the slight emphasis, the defensiveness threaded through it. And I thought about the way Sophie's smile had appeared too fast, like a mask grabbed from a hook. I thought about these things, and then I consciously chose to set them down. It was her engagement. She was happy. I was not going to be the kind of mother who soured the milk. The second thing happened at the venue walkthrough in January. The wedding was set for the 14th of June, a Saturday, which had required booking the Whitmore estate nearly a year in advance. Vivian had suggested the venue, and while I had privately thought it was more formal than Sophie's personality, Sophie had fallen in love with the rose gardens and the way the evening light fell through the old glass in the ballroom windows. I had not argued. The cost was significant. The Whitmore was not an inexpensive choice, but Sophie had said she and Daniel were covering the majority with their savings and that a portion would come from the trust, once the trustee authorized the disbursement after the marriage was formalized. This was, I knew, standard procedure. My father's attorney had explained the terms clearly years before. What was not standard, what snagged somewhere in the back of my mind during that walkthrough, was the moment I found myself standing near the venue coordinator's reception desk while Sophie and Daniel were photographing the ceremony terrace, and Vivian materialized at my elbow as though she had been there all along. She placed one hand lightly on my forearm and said, in that particular tone of hers that was both intimate and somehow rhetorical, "Margaret, I've been meaning to ask, do you know who Sophie uses for her banking? Only because Daniel's family has a relationship with Hargrove Private, and they do wonderful things for trusts and investments, and I thought perhaps we might all consolidate, make things simpler." I told her I had no idea what bank Sophie used. Vivian smiled and said, of course," and squeezed my arm once before drifting back toward the terrace. I stood there for a moment, watching a staff member rearrange chairs in the ballroom, and I felt the hairs along my forearms lift very slightly beneath my jacket. Consolidate. The word sat in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed without meaning to. I said nothing. I told myself she was merely being proactive. I told myself this is what mothers of grooms did, thought about the practical architecture of two lives merging. I told myself I was suspicious of Vivian simply because she was not the easiest woman to be warm toward, and that was my failing, not hers. I was very good during those months at telling myself things. March was when the pattern began to sharpen. Daniel started canceling plans with Sophie more frequently, always with reasons that were perfectly plausible and somehow never quite satisfying. A work crisis, a commitment with his firm's partners, a weekend his mother needed him for something vaguely described as a family matter. Sophie mentioned these cancellations with the particular lightness of a person who has decided to find something not worth worrying about, which itself worried me. She was not a light person by nature. She was careful, attentive, someone who noticed when things shifted. The lightness felt performed. Then there was the afternoon in April when I stopped by her apartment again. This time she was expecting me. We were going over catering preferences for the rehearsal dinner. And she was on the phone when I arrived. She held up one finger, mouthing, "Sorry," and I sat down at the kitchen island and began flipping through the notes I'd brought. I was not listening, or not intentionally, but her apartment was small and her voice carried, and I heard her say, clear as ice, "Daniel, I already told your mother. I'm not changing the beneficiary designation before the wedding. That's not how the trust works, and I'm not doing it." Then a pause, her voice lower now but still audible. "It's not about trust, it's about legality. Tell her to talk to the attorney if she has questions." She hung up, and I watched her set the phone down on the counter with a careful, controlled precision that I recognized. It was the way she put things down when she was trying not to throw them. She turned to me and smiled and said she was sorry, just a thing with the caterer Daniel had contacted. Nothing important. I looked at my daughter, and I looked at the way her jaw was set, and I thought, she is lying to me to protect me. And I thought, from what? I did not push. That was the mistake I replayed the most afterward. All the moments when I could have pushed and chose instead to smooth the surface and pretend the water beneath it was not moving. I did not push because I was afraid of what I would find. I did not push because Sophie was 3 months from a wedding and I did not want to hand her a crisis. I did not push because I had waited my entire adult life to see my daughter happy, and I could not bear to be the one who questioned it. June 14th arrived with that particular clarity that wedding mornings have. The light thin and gold, the sky an almost theatrical blue, the air carrying the sweetness of the rose gardens that had been in bloom for a week. I was at the Whitmore estate by 7 in the morning, overseeing the vendor setups with the efficiency that comes from 2 decades in the events industry. I knew this terrain, the way timelines could collapse in the final hours, the importance of walking every inch of the space before the guests arrived. I worked, I stayed busy. Staying busy is how I have always managed the things that threatened to overwhelm me. Sophie looked extraordinary. That is not a mother's bias, or not only that. She was genuinely, objectively luminous in the gown she'd chosen, a simple column of ivory silk with long sleeves that her grandmother's pearls clasped at the wrists. She was calm in a way that moved me. She had always been anxious before important events, a pacer and a list maker. But that morning she sat in the bridal suite while the stylist worked, and she looked out the window at the roses, and she seemed simply, entirely present. I held her hands before we went down, and I told her she was my greatest achievement, which is the truest thing I've ever said aloud, and she laughed and told me not to start because she'd just had her makeup done. But Daniel was wrong from the moment I saw him. I noticed it the way you notice a sound in a building you know well. Not alarming, not even definable at first, just an absence of something that should be there. He was standing with his groomsmen near the terrace doors when I passed through the ballroom, and he looked up and met my eyes for exactly a second before looking away. Not the way a man looks away in distracted happiness. The way a man looks away when looking at you is a thing he cannot currently afford. I stopped. I watched him from across the room for a moment. He was laughing at something one of the groomsmen said, but the laugh did not reach his eyes, and his left hand kept reaching for the inside pocket of his jacket and dropping away again. A gesture so repetitive it had the quality of a tick. I had never seen him do that before. I told myself he was nervous. Grooms were nervous. This was nothing. Vivienne found me 40 minutes before the ceremony, near the florist's staging area. She was magnificent in a dove-gray ensemble, her silver hair in a coil at her neck, and she kissed both my cheeks and said, "Wasn't it just a perfect day?" and took both my hands in hers. Her hands were cool and dry and very still. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I want you to know how much we've all come to love Sophie. She's going to be the heart of our family." I thanked her. I smiled. Her perfume was a heavy, musky floral, expensive and somehow, in that moment, slightly suffocating. I watched her move away through the guests toward the ceremony chairs, and I thought, without being able to say why, something is wrong. Something is happening right now, and you don't know what it is yet. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I cried, as I had known I would, and the tears were real. Whatever came after, whatever I learned, those tears were real, and I refused to let anyone take them from me. Sophie walked the aisle on the arm of her Uncle David, steady and radiant, her eyes going directly to Daniel's the moment she cleared the rose-covered arch and not moving from him. And Daniel did look at her, fully and without flinching, and in that moment, watching his face, I thought I had been wrong to be uneasy. He loved her. I could see it. Whatever else was true, that particular thing seemed, in that moment, real. It was during the cocktail hour that I lost him. Not literally. I saw him moving through the guests, glass in hand, performing the gracious groom with all the correct gestures. But twice in 40 minutes, I noticed him slip away from the main reception area. The first time I assumed he had gone to the restroom. The second time I watched more carefully, because something about the direction he moved was wrong. Not toward the corridor with the facilities, but toward the east wing of the estate, where the secondary rooms were located, the ones used for vendor staging and bridal party preparation that by that hour would be empty and quiet. I noted it. I kept my expression pleasant and continued the conversation I was having with one of Sophie's colleagues, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. And then Marcus, the videographer, touched my elbow. Marcus was 24, a young man Sophie had hired because she loved his cinematic style. He had a quiet intensity behind the camera that she trusted. He had been working the wedding since 9 in the morning, and he looked exhausted in the particular way of someone who has also just realized something terrible. He leaned close to me and said very quietly, "Mrs. Calloway, Margaret, I need to show you something. I'm not sure what to do with this. I almost didn't say anything, but I think you need to see it." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not, and the small hairs along my arms rose again, sharper this time, with a clarity that no longer felt like paranoia. He pressed his camera into my hands and showed me how to find the file he meant. A clip from approximately 90 minutes before the ceremony. He said he had been walking the East Wing doing ambient shots of the venue and had caught something through an open door and hadn't realized what he had until he reviewed the footage an hour ago while the guests were seated for dinner. He said he was sorry. He said it twice. I pressed play. The clip was 47 seconds long. It had been shot through an open doorway, one of the estate's smaller sitting rooms, a cream-walled space with a settee and a writing desk near the window. The camera had caught it from the hallway, slightly angled, and Marcus had clearly been moving and then stopped. The image was still for 30 of those 47 seconds. In that stillness, through the doorway, visible in clear mid-morning light, Daniel seated on the edge of the writing desk, and Vivian standing before him with a sheaf of papers in her hand. She was speaking. The camera had a microphone. I could hear her perfectly. "The disbursement happens within 48 hours of the marriage certificate being filed," she was saying, in the same warm tone she used at dinner parties. "At that point, it transfers to the joint account. The transfer to the holding company takes 3 business days after that. By the time she thinks to ask a question, it's already done." Daniel said something I could not fully catch. His voice was lower, faster, a murmur. Vivian tilted her head and said with absolute patience, "Daniel, she won't contest it. She trusts you. That's the entire point." Another murmur from Daniel. Then Vivian's voice, still patient, now with the faintest edge. "You've done everything right. Don't fall apart in the last hour." She put one hand on his face, the gesture of a woman steadying a child, and he closed his eyes and she said softly, "After today, we're set. All of us." Then there was movement in the hallway, and Marcus had begun moving again, and the clip ended. I stood in a corner of the Whitmore Estate's grand corridor, surrounded by the faint sound of dinner conversation and the clink of silverware and my daughter laughing somewhere in the ballroom, and I watched that 47 seconds again and again. My hands did not shake. I have thought about that since. I expected them to shake, expected the floor to tilt the way it does in films when the world comes apart. But what I felt was not dizziness. It was the opposite. It was the horrible, clarifying sensation of everything finally making sense. The word consolidate. Sophie's jaw set above her phone. She won't contest it. She trusts you. That's the entire point. I gave the camera back to Marcus. I asked him to save the file to 3 different locations immediately. His personal phone, the cloud backup, and a USB drive if he had one. He nodded. He asked me if I was all right. I told him I needed 15 minutes and that he should carry on filming normally. Then I walked to the restroom, locked the door, ran cold water over my wrists the way my mother had taught me to do when I was a child who overheated easily, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. My daughter was in the ballroom in her wedding dress. She had said her vows an hour ago. She was already legally married, and the man she had married had been sitting on a writing desk 90 minutes before the ceremony discussing the mechanics of draining her inheritance into a holding company, while his mother reminded him that Sophie's love for him was the entire point. I breathed in. I breathed out. I thought about my father, the careful, patient man who had worked 40 years to build something he could leave behind for the people he loved. I thought about the way Vivian had put her hand on Daniel's face like she was adjusting a piece that had drifted slightly out of position. I thought about Sophie's laugh coming from the ballroom and what it would do to her when she found out, and the thought was a blade, clean and cold, and I let myself feel it for exactly the duration of those 15 minutes. Then I dried my hands and I went to find my brother David. David was a quiet man, an accountant by profession, steady by nature, the kind of person who sat with facts until they came clear. He'd never particularly liked Daniel, a thing he had expressed precisely once, 6 months ago, saying only that Daniel struck him as a man who worked very hard at being charming and then going silent when I asked him to elaborate. I found him near the bar and I drew him aside, and I told him what I had seen. I watched his face go still in the way it went still when he was doing arithmetic, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Call Thomas Oakes tonight. First thing tomorrow at the latest." Thomas Oakes was my father's estate attorney. David said, "Don't confront either of them tonight. Don't do anything that puts them on alert. We need the marriage certificate filed for the evidence to be clean." He said it the way he said everything, quietly, without drama, as though explaining a column of numbers that did not add up. Then he squeezed my hand and said, "She's going to be all right. You are going to make sure of it." I went back to my table. I watched Vivian across the room all evening. The way she touched Daniel's arm, the small, proprietary gestures, the way she looked at my daughter with an expression that was fond and somehow at the same time slightly surgical. I watched Daniel. There were moments during dinner when his face went somewhere else entirely, a quick vacancy behind his eyes before he caught himself and came back. Once, near the end of the speeches, he looked across the room and found me, and his expression, just for an instant before he reassembled it, was the expression of a man who has stepped onto ice and is not certain it will hold. I smiled at him. I raised my glass. I held his gaze until he looked away first. I called Thomas Oakes from my car in the parking lot at 11:30 that night, after the last guests had gone and Sophie and Daniel were at their hotel. Thomas was 70 years old and had been my father's attorney for 25 of those years. I told him everything. He was quiet, and then he said, "Send me the video tonight." By 8:45 the next morning, he had found the rest of it. Vivian had retained a separate attorney 6 weeks prior to draft a marital property agreement designed to redirect Sophie's entire trust disbursement into a corporate entity co-registered to Vivian herself. Not a forgery. A real document, carefully drawn, designed to be placed in front of Sophie in the euphoric fog of her first days of marriage. And the paperwork Daniel had handed to Vivian's attorney, the trust documents he had provided, he had taken them from Sophie's own files at home. I told Sophie that afternoon. I sat with her on the edge of the hotel bed and took her hands and said everything. She listened with the stillness she'd had since childhood. When I finished, she said quietly, "He took the documents from my files." Not a question. When confronted, Daniel said, "I love her. That was always real." Sophie said, "You sat on that desk and let your mother tell you my love for you was the point. Those are not the same thing." He had nothing. No architecture that held. Vivian arrived within the hour, composed and silver-haired, and said there had been a misunderstanding. I said, "There is a 47-second video and a financial fraud attorney who disagrees with you." The composure held one more moment, then shifted into cold recalibration. "No document had been signed," she said. "Technically true," Thomas confirmed, "but sufficient for civil fraud and enough for both parties to settle fast." They did. Daniel did not contest the divorce. A financial penalty went to the charity Sophie chose. Vivian was gone. The divorce finalized 4 months later. Sophie found a quieter apartment and spent November repotting plants and returning to the book club she had dropped when she got engaged. She called me on a Tuesday in December and said, "I'm okay, Mom. Not performed okay. Actually, okay." I believed her. I sit on the porch on Aldersham Lane now, and the hydrangeas are bare in winter, but they will come back in June, the way they always do. My father built something he believed in and left it to the person he loved most. It survived. Not because no one tried to take it, but because I stopped looking away in time. Sophie still has her grandfather's trust. It is entirely, irrevocably hers. And she knows now what it is worth. And more importantly, she knows exactly who she is.